obscure, unknown figure. And yet, the style and comments in the assassination portion of the letter, we were hoping that it's not some far-right nut, but a commie nut, are kind of odd things to write to a child. So it definitely seems like some sort of contemporary, some sort of maybe friend or a very, very close friend that Barbara knows well and is kind of comfortable talking with. It's not clear from Barbara's memoir really who the recipients of the letter were. She says, dearest family, and that it was a letter home, but those of her children who at the time were all at home were 10 years old or younger. The eldest, George W., was away at prep school in New England. Also, it would seem odd to write a letter home if you were only gone from home for several days in literally just taking a trip around the state in an in-state campaign swing. You'd likely be back home before the letter arrived. And she signed a bar, not the typical identifier to the young children. So the letter home more logically would have been to her other home, and that is to her parents. That's interesting, living in the house she had left nearly 2 decades before. But the scenario doesn't really make sense much. That scenario doesn't make sense either. Her mother died in 1940, and her father had remarried. Barbara had not been known to be especially close to her family during a period of many years, and not even really attended her mother's funeral. It was love to all intended for her father and stepmother. Her siblings had also long left the nest, and perhaps she circulated a correspondence among them, possible. Besides, how did Barbara happen upon such a letter that she purportedly written 30 years earlier? Had she kept a copy and recently discovered it? Again, we're talking 60s to 90s when the stuff was released. Kind of insane. Whether or not the letter was an authentic contemporaneous document, one can assume that many of the particulars that day were in the letter because they were true and verifiable. Hence, they are of interest here. Poppy's call to the FBI about Parrott being the potential assassin obviously did nothing to assist the FBI in any meaningful way, but it clearly did something else. It established in government files that at the time of the assassination in Dallas, Poppy and Barbara were in Tyler, Texas. These were things that Poppy had good reason to want established, as we'll see. The notion that there was more to the phone call than simple altruism and patriotism can be found in examination of the most seemingly insipid of matters, Barbara's lunch with Doris. Probably the most boring part of this whole letter, right? Although there were numerous Doris Ulmers in the United States at the time, only one matches the description of an old friend who would help Poppy when Poppy visited Greece, and who was a 1963 resident of London, which was Mrs. Alfred C. Ulmer Jr. God, we had fun. Ulmer is sometimes described as as having filled the portions of kind of attaché and first secretary at the U.S. Embassy in Athens from the late 40s through the mid-50s. Yet a memorial tribute to him in the alumni publication of his alma mater, Princeton, scores higher on the candor meter, describing his life in the wartime OSS and CIA. So intelligence through and through. Deep, deep ties to intelligence. And interestingly enough, Doris was lunching with Barbara on that very fateful day. Who was not there? Poppy and Al. Interesting. Ulmer was also a good friend and confidant to CIA Director Allen Dulles. He embodied the attitude that nobody could tell the CIA what to do. Nobody. We went all over the world and we did what we wanted. God, we had fun, he said. Yeah, God, we had fun. Just wrecking countries left and right with no regard for literally any of the people who lived there. God, we had so much fun. Awesome stuff, right? Anyway, when JFK forced Dulles out of the CIA following the Bay of Pigs, Ulmer left as well. He went to work for the Greek shipping magnate Stavros Niarchos. That Ulmer had not fully left the espionage racket is suggested in part by Niarchos' long history with the CIA, and that's a special trick you should know in terms of looking at the CIA. If people say they resigned from prior service, it is very likely that they in fact did not, and are especially at a young age where it doesn't really make any sense that they would resign. Like, they just go through all this training and then, we resigned. Resigned. My bad. I'm out of here. Bye. Done with the CIA thing. It's very, very likely, especially if they go into kind of a career like regarding oil or shipping and high finance position, that they are still in contact in some way with the CIA. It's a pretty safe assumption most of the time. By 1963, Poppy Bush seems to have known Ulmer for at least a decade. The reference in Barbara's letter to Ulmer's being so nice to Poppy when Poppy visited Greece likely referred to the early 1950s when Ulmer was station chief at Athens and Poppy Bush was beginning his vernacular world travels ostensibly on behalf of his modest-sized Midland Oil Company. Apparently, the relationship had continued because records at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College, Texas show Bush stopping off to see Ulmer in London in the summer of 1963. So they had definitely had a lot of contact. Besides Doris Ulmer, the other person that Barbara mentioned in her letter was a Mr. Zeppo, the man who had lent them the plane on November 22nd. And as with so many other clues in documents concerning Poppy Bush, this one appears to be a dead end until one realized that the name might have been misspelled. There was, in fact, no Zeppo, but there could have been a man, there was a man, since deceased, by the name of Zeppa. Joe Zeppa, founder of the Tyler-based Delta Drilling Company, which became one of the world's largest contract oil drillers with operations across the globe. By the time Poppy came to Tyler to speak to Kiwanis, Joe Zeppa was a good man to know. One of his sons, Chris, had previously served as county Republican chairman, and Joe Zeppa had owned and lived in the Blackstone Hotel, the site of the speech that Bush was giving that day. Barbara, in her letter, notes the use of Zeppa's plane to leave Tyler earlier in the afternoon. What she does not mention at all is that most likely Poppy and her also arrived on Zeppa's plane. And the very fact that Zeppa lent a plane to Poppy is surprising, considering Zeppa's son Keating, who was on company business in Argentina at the time, said Joe Zeppa was not a great one for having an actual active hand in a political campaign. He was not one to say, "Here, I'll send the plane after you." If Joe Zeppa was given a direction, or was going in a given direction, and a politician wanted to go along, that was fine with him. So he was not a guy to just willy-nilly hand out planes to everybody. When told that the plane bypassed Dallas's downtown Love Field, dropped Zeppa off at the Fort Worth Municipal Airport and then backtracked to Dallas, Keating, Zeppa, said that was not something his father ordinarily would have done, kind of going out of his way to give the plane to HW. Though the movements of Zeppa's plane on the afternoon of November 22nd, once it left Tyler, are intriguing, much more important is where it came from on the morning of November 22nd, which is Dallas. The following facts have never been recounted by Poppy Bush, nor have they appeared in any articles or books, and Barbara herself says nothing about this. On the evening of November 21st, Poppy Bush spoke to a gathering of the American Association of Oil Drilling Contractors at the Sheraton in Dallas. Since Zeppa himself was a former president of the AAODC, it was very likely that he could have been gathering. It's also very likely that Zeppa and the Bushes actually spent the night in Dallas, and they were in Dallas the next morning, the day Kennedy was assassinated. So this brings us to the vexing question of Poppy's motive in calling the FBI at 1:45 p.m. Why would they want to do that? Why would they just say, "Oh yeah, it was James Parrott. Yeah, sure." He told the FBI that he expected to spend the night on November 22nd at the Sheraton Hotel in Dallas, but instead, after flying to Dallas on the Zeppa's plane, had left again almost immediately on a commercial flight to Houston. Why state that he expected to spend the night at Dallas Sheraton if he was not planning to stay? Perhaps this was to create a little confusion, to blur the fact he had already stayed at the hotel the night before. Anyone inquiring will learn that Bush was in Tyler at the time of the assassination and planned to stay in Dallas afterward, but canceled following JFK's death. And then, of course, there was the whole matter of Parrott, the Republican operative who George H.W. Bush had made that kind of weird, inexplicable call to the FBI just after Kennedy was assassinated, saying that there was a strange young man making threats against the president. Very weird. So what follows from here and this point out is just a very, very weird series of events where almost kind of inexplicably we see Poppy just calling this guy James Parrott, who was kind of this low, very, very low level employee within the Harris kind of Houston Republican Party, really didn't go as further really than painting signs, than had a 7th grade education, had like a brother in jail, just was not kind of one of those high-flying oil executives, very different from the other people that, for example, Barbara Bush mentioned in her call, and the people that normally associated with the Bush clan and just people in this story. And the allegations that he made, that Bush made, really weirdly enough, was that he was making some threats against the president, and Bush HW was very careful to pass the buck to people who could know more. And as it turns out, for some strange reason, at the exact moment around, just as the news of Kennedy's death had become public, there was an assistant to Bush, Mr. Kearney Reynolds, at the house. And this is proven that he was at the house and was able to vouch for the whereabouts of Kearney, or of Parrott, the supposed suspect, if you went by the Bush call, at the exact moment when the assassination was made public, and his mother vouched for him for the rest of the day. So he was kind of he was out of the face of the investigation, and as most people were able to kind of ascertain very, very quickly, had no involvement in any way whatsoever with the assassination of Kennedy. So really, the net effect of this all is really remarkable about all this, is that at the precise moment when Poppy was calling the FBI with this quote-unquote tip about a possible suspect about whom he could offer very few details, Poppy's own assistant was a suspect at the suspect's home, transacting business with him on behalf of Poppy himself. Clearly, Parrott was far better known to Poppy than he let on. Why was Reynolds supposed to go to Parrott's house at this time? Really, the net effect was that Reynolds bailed out Parrott by providing him with an alibi. Thus, Parrott became Poppy's alibi, and Poppy's assistant, because of course he was on the call talking to the FBI at the time, and Poppy's assistant became Parrott's. So Reynolds became Parrott's. Everyone was taken care of, and while the point was to generate two separate alibis, drawing attention to their interconnection was problematic. The fact that these two people were associated was problematic. Because really, when the full picture began to emerge, the entire affair appeared to be a ruse to create a paper trail clearing Poppy, should that become necessary. Parrott was merely a distraction and a minor casualty, albeit a person who ought not face lasting consequences, or, especially here, attract a lot of undue attention. When more details came out about that FBI report, it really turned out that Parrott was quite harmless, not someone who was insane, not someone who was kind of mentally challenged, not someone who was really, he just wasn't that bright of a guy. He could really barely fend for himself. He wasn't a madman or a psychopath or anything like that. He had only a 7th grade education. He'd been discharged from the Air Force by a psychiatrist, gone into sign painting, lived with his mother, and apparently volunteered regularly with the Harris GOP quietly and without incident, until he was subject to that weird Bush phone call. So, in conclusion here, the cumulative result was that Poppy was listed in government files as having been in Tyler on November 22nd, 1963, while Parrott faced no long-term consequences for having been accused. In an interview in 1993, Parrott would insist that for many years he'd been unaware that it was Bush that had made this accusation against him. He also noted that he had actually gone on to work for Bush's unsuccessful presidential re-election campaign in 1992, and in an article covering that frenzied GOP convention podium attack on Clinton and Gore over the classic Republican talking point of family values, Parrott is described as passing out flyers saying no queers or baby killing while wearing a plastic shield on his face, explaining it was for protection against the AIDS virus. So, as the time passed, Parrott increasingly told a story that meshed with Bush's, inflating his own significance along the lines of what Bush forces were putting out. It was mainly a rumor put out that he was trying to neutralize us, he said in the 1993 interview, claiming that he and other conservatives were in the middle of a bitter struggle with Bush and other moderates. And again, this is a guy who was a volunteer. Like, he wasn't struggling with Bush about anything, over the need to go over these suspected communist activities. That said, the notion that Parrott was active in any sort of aggressive right circle seems either untrue or irrelevant to what actually happened on that day. More likely, Parrott was simply set up, his right-wing ideology used as a red herring by the Bushes to legitimate his phone call. After all, why would Parrott even be such a threat to the FBI without his clear ideological connections to right-wing ideology? So, here's another interesting thing. These names, these other witnesses that would supposedly vouch for Bush's story with regards to what Parrott did. Mrs. Foley is actually Mrs. Thawley, F versus TH, and Arline Smith turned out to be Arlene Smith. So either Poppy or this FBI agent, who was also quite close